the order. Welcome to the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee, and it's wonderful to welcome the Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Hilary Benn, the Parliamentary Under Secretary for State, Fleur MP, Julie Harrison and Mark Davies. So thank you very much for your time today. I am aware that you would like to make opening remarks, and that you are welcome to make them. But before we do that, I'd just like to remind everybody we may be disrupted for votes. And also, for the purposes of this session, the Speaker has granted a waiver to the sub judice rule in relation to the Government's appeal against the Dillon judgment. So we are able to discuss that. Okay, and I'd like to Secretary of State, your opening comments, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chair and members of the committee. Can I begin by saying how much Fleur and I, and indeed all the team at the NIO, are looking forward to working with you. Thanks very much for inviting us to appear before you today. As Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I've got three main priorities. The first is working with the Northern Ireland Executive to champion Northern Ireland as a fantastic place to invest in, to create jobs in, and to improve public services. Secondly, implementing the Windsor framework and protecting the UK internal market. And thirdly, addressing the legacy of the past. Now, fundamental to all of these tasks is good relationships with everyone. Since taking office, I've visited Northern Ireland on, someone counted, 19 occasions, involving over 100 different external engagements. The Prime Minister made 2 visits. He's met the Taoiseach twice, and 14 different government ministers have been over to engage with their counterparts. Those relationships obviously include the First and Deputy First Minister, who I meet on a regular basis, the Irish Government, in my case in particular with the Taoiseach, and the EU, with which we want to negotiate an SPS and veterinary agreement, which could help a lot with the operation of the Windsor framework. No doubt we're going to discuss legacy. In a moment, I just want to put on record my and the government's determination to repeal and replace the Legacy Act, and in doing so to produce legislation that is both human rights compliant and commands public confidence. And I want to seeking to work in a spirit of openness as I do that. I also want to thank the PSNI, who time and again exemplify their commitment to keep the people of Northern Ireland safe, as they did during the disorder over the summer, in which a number of them were injured. Finally, can I just say that the Good Friday Agreement is the bedrock on which Northern Ireland's transformation, and it is a transformation over the last 26 years, has been based. The government's commitment to the Good Friday Agreement is absolute, and the sense I get is that the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland just want to move forward, to embrace a better future. I see my role as supporting them to do that, and I'm really looking forward to it. And if I may pass over to Fleur.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Hilary. I'll join you in welcoming all the committee members to your positions. It will be an honour to work with you, and congratulations, Chair, on your role as well. So since my appointment 18 weeks ago, I've also counted up and I've visited 15 times and held 70 external engagements, because I just think it's really important to be speaking to as many people as I can. I've met businesses, unions, schools, arts organisations, community and voluntary groups and networks. And I've also met with Northern Ireland ministers and UK government ministers in Northern Ireland and here. I just think we can achieve more if we work together. There are some very real pressures facing public services in Northern Ireland, and the Executive are making very difficult choices to tackle these urgently. Whilst this issue has of course evolved, the Government is committed to working collaboratively to support the Northern Ireland Executive, the Assembly and local leaders to deliver better public services, especially in critical areas such as health and education. Another pressing issue that I'm focusing on is child poverty. Child poverty in Northern Ireland, the committee will know the latest child poverty figures show a marked increase in the proportion of children living both in poverty and in absolute poverty. This is a unique situation in Northern Ireland in that there is poverty, criminality and paramilitary violence, which are all interlinked issues and pose a serious threat not only to the difficulty of tackling poverty but also to reconciliation and stability. As part of my role on the Government's new Child Poverty Taskforce, I am working to ensure that children in Northern Ireland and across the UK have a brighter and healthier future. And for another issue, I know that many of you will share my concern about the prevalence of violence against women and girls in Northern Ireland. Since 2020, 24 women and girls have been murdered. I welcome the Executive Office's new strategic framework on this issue. I'm sure we'll be talking about it more later. And also I welcome the First and Deputy First Minister's commitment to prioritising tackling this appalling trend. And finally, another area of focus is reconciliation, which is at the heart of all of our work. It's absolutely intrinsic to everything we do. Although some good progress has been made, sectarianism, racism and inter- and intra-community conflict still pose significant barriers, including for social and economic progress. We are committed to promoting reconciliation by upholding the Good Friday Agreement, expanding integrated education, tackling paramilitarism, and investing more than £730 million into the new Peace Plus programme. And across all my work, I'm making a conscious effort to engage widely with all parts of Northern Ireland's diverse and vibrant communities, especially those who've previously not felt listened to or been heard by governments of the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you both for highlighting your key priorities for you in the department over the coming years. So, Secretary of State, your ministerial responsibilities include work to ensure that Northern Ireland is fully engaged in the development and delivery of the UK government's missions-led approach. What does this actually mean in practice?
Well, there is a balance to be struck here, because on the one hand, there is very considerable, as you will know, devolution to the Executive and the Assembly. On the other hand, the UK, particularly the new government, has a great interest in ensuring that the missions are met throughout the UK. And as I've reflected on precisely the question that you have just put to me, I think the best way to progress this is through partnership, sharing experience and offering assistance. So there are examples of what we've already done, for instance, on economic growth. Now that all the city deals are back on track after a small pause, that is a considerable investment by the UK government and indeed by the Northern Ireland Executive. And I have to say, I have been so impressed by the ambition and the vision that all those city deals have shown for the new economy of the new Northern Ireland in so many different ways. On policing, safer streets, we have provided some additional funding through the recent budget in the additional security funding. And on the NHS, I mean, Fleur has been doing a lot of work on this and may want to say something about how our mission in relation to the NHS relates to the huge task that the Executive has, given that Northern Ireland has the worst, and I mean the worst, NHS waiting list in the whole of the United Kingdom.
So each of our missions maps in a different way, and I think for the health service it's absolutely clearly devolved. However, there's so much that we can learn together, and I would describe it as an active partnership. So what are the best ways in which health service transformation is happening across different parts of the UK? How can different parts of the UK learn from Northern Ireland? Last week I was with Minister Nesbitt going to different types of healthcare provision, from multidisciplinary teams to elective surgery in Mater Hospital, and looking at different ways in which we can learn. So it's about funding, yes, but it's about a lot more than, I think, funding. Another mission would be GB Energy as well, where we're working on the GB Energy Bill, so that we're very clearly working on our missions together.
And the one other thing I'd add on public service transformation, part of the deal which the previous government did when the institutions were restored was to set aside £235 million, as you'll be aware, for public services transformation, because in talking to the First and Deputy First Minister and other ministers, they will say, well, I'm working really hard to keep the show on the road with the funding I've got here. How do I take some of that out to invest in transforming the services so they're more effective? And the Public Services Transformation Fund recognised that and said, OK, if you've got proposals you want to bring forward where we can provide additional funding to help you begin to make those changes, then that is the mechanism. Julie Harrison sits on the Public Services Transformation Board. I think there are 11 projects that you have decided should be taken forward. You might want to add a word about that, because it is quite important, that.
Yeah, so there were 47 projects proposed by Northern Ireland departments. Just for everybody, the role of the Transformation Board, it was part of the condition of the restoration deal under the last government. The money's ring-fenced, and it's a partnership with the Executive in terms of that decision-making. but the interim board, of which I am one of 3 people, essentially tests the kind of value for money. Is it really going to transform things? Will this deliver either a more sustainable budget or better outcomes for citizens? Does it change the delivery model? 47 applications came in. Very shortly, I think the chair of the board will be writing to the Minister of Finance. And at that point, the Minister of Finance recommends it to the Northern Ireland Executive. So to be clear, it's the Executive that takes the decisions. We're a sort of a quality check, first and foremost.
Okay, and I'm sure there'll be further questions on that. So
Happy
thank you, thank you very much. I mean, but how has that been welcomed, Secretary of State? I know that it's often difficult to have discussions with devolved governments and them feel like you may be stepping on their toes. Have you had any of that, or have you been welcomed with open arms?
Well, I think the honest answer has been work in progress, really. I'm very keen to build good relationships with all of the people I have the privilege of working with. There have been 1 or 2 bumps along the way, and the City Deals was definitely a bump, but I have to say the joy we all felt when I went to co-sign the heads of terms for the Mid-South West deal, well, that's now the past, and we are looking to the future. Of course, all devolved governments say sometimes this is for us, but then on other occasions they say if they've got a problem, can you please give us more money? And I think one of the things to recognise, we may come on to funding, but the recent budget, 640 million this year, 1.5 billion next year, which is, let's be frank, quite a bit more than the Executive was expecting. They've already allocated it out in their latest monitoring round. And I would just make the point, all governments, whether it's the UK government, the Northern Ireland Executive, Scotland, Wales, has to make decisions about how it's going to spend money and how it's going to raise money to boost their spending. And there's no getting away in any circumstance from that choice. Quite properly, Northern Ireland gets additional funding because of its additional needs. This year's budget, it's 24% more. And therefore, to take the example of health service waiting lists, some people might ask the question, I wish more people did in Northern Ireland, you have 24% more funding than England, and yet you have the worst waiting lists in the whole of the United Kingdom. How exactly has that come about? But more crucially, what are you going to do about it?
Thank you. And I'd like to turn to the Minister now and just find out a little bit more, about your role, which is to lead on other voices and reconciliation. And what does that involve?
So it's a couple of sides of it are, first of all, who I meet, so my time and my engagement, and ensuring that some of those communities that sometimes are not heard as much as others are listened to. That is going to the mosque in Belfast. I've been working with the African Caribbean Support Organisation for Northern Ireland. I've worked with Cara Friend, the LGBTQ young people. It's something I've specifically wanted to make sure that there's a focus and listening to their concerns and bringing them back in all the other meetings that I then have. So a lot of it is about connecting as well. So when I have meetings to be able to then go and meet with ministers in Northern Ireland, but also meet ministers across Whitehall to say these are the issues I'm hearing, and to make sure that I've heard them in the round. And then another aspect of that is about funding as well. So meeting with Disability NI, for example, the Rural Women's Network, and seeing the work that is going on in the Peace Plus programme and UK SPF, the funding that is coming from the government and how that's being spent and where, and assessing it against not only the outcomes in terms of economic outcomes, but also outcomes in terms of are we working with all the communities that we should be working with, and what is the result of that. And then feeding that back into future funding potential as well, and making sure that it's aligned as much as I can.
Well, thank you, Minister. That's really interesting, and we look forward to maybe having a further conversation with that. I think it would be remiss of me not to ask what conversations the Secretary of State and the Minister have been having with the Treasury and DEFRA, especially as today we have the agriculture and farming community outside of Parliament. What has been and what conversations have you had to assess the impact of the agricultural inheritance tax on the farming communities in Northern Ireland.
Well, I met the Ulster Farmers Union this morning because they're over for the protest today, and I also had a brief conversation with a number of young farmers after a Westminster Hall debate that I did a little bit earlier. And look, I completely understand the concern that has been expressed because this is a big change. Because we have had a long period since 1992 where there's been 100% agricultural property relief when it came to farms. Interestingly, prior to 1992, that was not the case. Indeed, the inheritance tax regime applying to farming 1991, 1990 and further back was less generous than the one that will be introduced in April 27. And so one of the points I asked was, I don't remember there being a great kerfuffle at the time when it was a less generous regime than the one that is proposed. I think the second frustration for everybody is there is obviously an argument going on about to how many estates will it apply. Because the Treasury is very clear. They've done their analysis and they say about 25%, but I think every farmer I met today is convinced it is going to apply to them. Now, both of those things can't be true. And I think the way I look at it is this. If in the whole, since 92, you haven't had to think about this at all, and now you are going to have to think about it. What does it mean for your estate planning? What are the various allowances depending on the ownership structure of the farm? Have you got a spouse? Can you share allowances between you? And that is something with all of the other things that farmers have got to deal with. You know, making a living, the weather, the challenges that they've got. Of course, it is not welcome to them that they've got to add that to the list. Now, only time will tell what the outcome is, but the farmers, of course, as they're entitled to, are making their voice heard. And farming, speaking as a former DEFRA secretary, is absolutely vital to the future of the world, the country, and to Northern Ireland, where it plays such an important part in rural life, but the life of the economy overall.
Thank you. Anybody, would you like to come in?
Please, Chair.
Yes.
Thank you, Secretary of State, Minister. Very nice to see you. Two quick questions. One to follow on from the Chair, Secretary of State. Can you just outline if you did have any specific conversations? That was a question the Chair posed, and I think the committee would appreciate hearing some more on that. And secondly, to the NIO, how many, or what assessment has the NIO made of the number of farmers who will be affected by this? And has an assessment been made by the department?
Your first question is discussions with...
Well, it was repeating the Chair's point, because I don't think you quite touched on the specific conversations with Treasury and DEFRA, which was the question, I believe.
Well, I've had a conversation with the Environment Secretary. I have not had a discussion with any Treasury ministers thus far, just to answer that question, apologies. Yeah. I mean, in terms of the assessment, I'm not aware that there is a Northern Ireland specific assessment that's been undertaken. And I think that may be something to do with the form in which the records are held.
Yeah, so I think the Agriculture Minister in Northern Ireland, so DERA have done an initial assessment. I think that went to the Assembly maybe 6th of November. So they, as the kind of responsible department for it in Northern Ireland, are trying to kind of work that through.
But NIO didn't do something similar. I mean, it would have made, I would have thought, some sense to,
well,
whilst things have devolved, there should surely be, when there's decisions made in Westminster, an element of thinking.
I think as normal practice, we certainly try and look at this stuff, but all the data is devolved, all of the information is devolved, so it's right for DERA to kind of step back and look at this with our support, certainly, but no, it would be for DERA to do that. And
have there been specific conversations between officials at NIO and DERA?
We are constantly working with colleagues right across the Northern Ireland Civil Service, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring in Gavin. I am aware that we will have to suspend the session because votes are imminent, but if we can answer Gavin's question and see when the bell falls.
Thanks very much, Chair. I think Secretary of State, these questions really relate to whether your role is to be the government's champion in Northern Ireland or Northern Ireland's champion within the government. We are going to take evidence on this issue, but I can tell you that there is a greater density of farms that remain in sole ownership or family ownership than the case in England, for example, Scotland and Wales. And also that land values per acre, agricultural land, is worth more in Northern Ireland than in England, Scotland or Wales, and therefore there's a greater disproportionate hit to the people of Northern Ireland. So the question being asked, have you raised that with Treasury colleagues? I think what we would like to hear from you is that you're prepared to do so and prepared to indicate to your colleagues that the change in inheritance tax relief is going to have a disproportionate hit on farmers and rural families in Northern Ireland than it will in other parts of the United Kingdom.
Well, to answer your question directly, Mr. Robinson, my role is to be both. I, of course, am an advocate for Northern Ireland in the government. That is my job, and you would expect it. But I am also a cabinet minister who upholds collective cabinet responsibility, as everyone around the table will recognise. As and when more information emerges about the impact, and quite properly the committee is asking today, what might this mean in relation to Northern Ireland, then of course that needs to be considered by those who are taking the policy forward. We're at a stage, as I said in answering your first question, Chair, we're at a stage where there is an absence of some of that, and there is a fundamental difference of view about how people are going to be affected, which adds to the concern, because you've got a very large number of people who think this is going to apply to me. It may turn out that that is not the case, and that is the Treasury's view. And in any political debate and discussion, a different starting point on what a proposition actually means is not a helpful place to begin from, because if we could agree a set of facts about the implications, including the impact of higher land values in some parts of the United Kingdom compared to others, well, that would be a good thing, because we'd have a more informed debate.
Okay, as the bell has not gone, I shall go over to Katrina, sorry.
Sure.
Thank you, Secretary. I want to take you back to the fiscal framework that you alluded to earlier on. What progress has the government made in the negotiations on a final fiscal framework with the Northern Ireland Executive? And yeah.
Okay, so we'll pause the recording. Order. order. Thank you very much. We'll restart with Katrina Murray.
Yeah. Just to recap, Secretary of State, I'd like to understand what progress the government's made in the negotiations on the final fiscal framework with the Northern Ireland Executive.
This is a very important process. I welcome the interim fiscal framework, which the last government negotiated with the Northern Ireland Executive, and the package involved in the restoration, and I referred earlier to the additional funding we've made available through the budget. The Finance Minister, Kiva Archibald, has met the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on more than one occasion, and those discussions will continue. On the level of the funding, you know, the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council was established to answer the question, so Northern Ireland has greater needs, how much extra should it get compared to England? And the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council, headed by Sir Robert Choate, looked at this and said, well, it could be anywhere between 121 and 127, 124 is in the middle, that's what we suggest. And the funding this year meets that overall in recognition of the additional needs. But at the same time, part of the deal reached after restoration, or was part of restoration, was a balanced budget this year. Now, the additional funding that came through the budget will assist enormously. The Executive has had its monitoring round where it's divvied up the additional cash. 350, I think, million has gone to health, which consumes a very considerable part of the budget for understandable reasons. But there is still a gap that needs to be closed, because the arrangement was if you don't close the gap, then the Treasury will say, I'm afraid you've got to pay back the overspend from previous years that you're encouraged to not have to pay back by balancing your budget this year. So the Kiva Archibald has been very clear with her colleagues, we need to do this. But I think it's making reasonable progress. But obviously the final fiscal framework is yet to be concluded, and that will result from the negotiations I've referred to. The other thing I would say about the interim fiscal framework is it did say if I think multiple credible sources of information that suggest the figure should be other than 124%, then the government would consider that. So that was built in as part of the interim deal that's been signed.
So just following on from that, you said yes, there is that multiple credible sources. What representations have you had to review the 124% figure?
Well, the credible source at the moment is the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council. That's why it was established. It was asked to do the job, and it came up with the 124% figure. People may argue that's not enough. Can we have more? I've yet in my time in government ever encountered anyone who said, oh, thank you very much, you've given me too much, can I hand some of it back? That's not how it works. But at the moment, that is the credible source. The commitment was in there, negotiated by the previous government. And of course, if the circumstances change, the government has responsibility to look at that. But I'm not aware, as I sit here in front of you today, that there are multiple credible sources saying, no, 124 is wrong, it should be X.
Okay. But also that following on the other part where you were looking at the repayment of the 159 million in overspends, if the Executive is unable to balance its current year budget, will the government enforce the repayment of that overspend?
Well, there was a deal reached. It was a deal. And the previous government made that part of the condition. It also said that the Executive had to raise some funding itself, 113 million. Originally, that had to be over 1 year. The Executive made the argument, I think quite reasonably, that's a bit tight, can we do it over 2? And the previous government said, OK, you can. But as I indicated earlier, all politics, all government is about making choices. Now, there are a number of decisions that the Northern Ireland Executive has made over the years to spend money on various things or not to raise finance from various sources. You know, there's been a long debate about water charges in Northern Ireland. Now, there are there are plenty of people in Northern Ireland who could well afford to pay water charges. But if you don't make use of the means that are available to you to raise funding, then it's going to be more difficult to balance the budget. But I welcome what Kiva Archibald has said, because she's quite clear with her colleagues, we need to balance the budget this year.
I'm just going to bring in Adam Georgie.
Sure.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary, you touched on health both in terms of the financial pressures and the pressures on service delivery. On Sunday evening, Alan Stout, the chair of BMA Northern Ireland, tweeted, and I quote, "A genuine question meant to be apolitical, brackets, but my view has changed over the past week, close bracket. Can the NHS in Northern Ireland survive without one of the two main parties in charge? I am," this is Alan, "seriously worried about marginalisation, reprioritisation and excessive politicking." Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I'm going to turn to Fleur, because Fleur's been doing a lot of work on the health service.
I've met with Dr. Alan Stout as well, and I've talked with other medical organisations bringing together professionals in Northern Ireland. And there was a recent conference at which Professor Benn, who wrote a report back in 2016 about how the health service can be transformed, has come back to say, yes, there's been some progress, but there needs to be a lot more. That needs to include the GPs, which is what Dr. Allen is referring to, and the changes in financial circumstances. It's got to agree all of the health worker pay negotiations, and it has to agree on top of that an actual change to how the health service is structured. So all of those have got to go on, and we will be supporting them as they do. And there are many healthcare professionals, just as there are many people in Northern Ireland who are on those waiting lists. If you're on your waiting list for a knee operation for 5 to 6 years, you're asking the same thing as well. Can this be fixed? We're asking that too, but I'm glad that the executive is taking such big steps, and we're going to be next to them all the way.
And the only thing can I just add relating to the first part of the quote that you read out. Look, the governance system in Northern Ireland is as it is, and has been since the Good Friday Agreement. And whoever is in government in Northern Ireland has a responsibility to make sure that it takes decisions that improve public services, in this case, not least in respect of those who are waiting a very, very, very long time for treatment. And I find it hard to see how the argument can be made that because of the nature of power sharing, it is not possible to do that. It is the responsibility of those in government. That's what devolved government is all about. Now, as we've indicated with additional funding and the kind of support that and encouragement that Fleur has been talking about, we really stand ready to support them in that process, but ultimately it falls to the executive to do it.
Thank you. I'm moving on to Lee Ingham.
Thank you very much. Secretary, what will be Northern Ireland's allocation from the 900 million UK Shared Prosperity Fund for the year 25-26? Oh, sorry.
So that's the part I'm doing, you know. So up until the interim budget, that was going to be finishing next March, and so, community organisations who were getting this funding were rightly really worried about that, and some of the delivery is absolutely excellent, getting people into work, all sorts of programmes that have the trust of communities as well. So they were rightly concerned about what was going to happen in March, and I'm really glad that it's continued, even though it is disappointing that it is less than it was. The negotiations are still underway. There's a meeting with the board, who are the stakeholder board for that fund are community organisations in Northern Ireland. So it is being done very transparently with some of the organisations who will be overseeing then that work going forward. But the actual allocation has not yet been decided, but we're certainly making sure that it is known how important those voluntary organisations are for communities in Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much. Just a quick follow-up then. The NIO has been given £1 million in 25-26 to support Northern Ireland community projects. How will this money be used or allocated? Is that also
yeah, it is. It's a good news story. So as part of the restoration package, the issue about lots of community organisations, especially smaller ones, not being able to get some of the funding that's available was raised, and this £1 million is going to be for a capacity and capability support package specifically for smaller organisations. I went to Sorshaw's constituency last week and saw one of those potential organisations, a small community organisation, a residents' association, doing brilliantly, but saying, oh, it's really hard to get funding. And I'm hoping that £1 million will really be enable capacity development and support so that they can be addressed. It's across different communities, different kinds of funding. Yeah.
Make an intervention there, Minister. I was interested to hear that, this is great news, good news story about this funding. Will that be multi-year funding, or is it just for that year? Is it just a one-off? Because we know how difficult it is for the third sector, for the charities, if they can't plan unless they know in advance. Is that something that's likely to change?
It is for several years.
Okay.
So it's early days for developing this, and I hope to come back to the committee in the future and say how this is developed, because it's early years, but it is not just for 1 year, which is also a good thing.
Good, it is. Excellent. Sorry, Lee.
No problem. Thank you very much. And then going back slightly as well, you referred to the Public Service Transformation Board earlier and the work that they're doing. How are you planning to work with the Northern Ireland Executive on implementing this?
I think since Julie sits on the board, it might be useful for now, but to hear from her.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yes, so look, I think both ministers have articulated very clearly what we're trying to do. I think I said earlier that was a condition of restoration under the previous government. It's ring-fence money. The interim board essentially is receiving applications from departments and providing that kind of, these are the strongest ones, and putting it to the executive. I think the aspiration for that work is that it will help the executive around some of those choices they have to make more broadly. So actually it's a conversation about the 18 billion, not the ring-fenced money by itself. And I think ministers will be talking to Keith Archibald about that soon. But essentially it's trying to sort of think through if actually you're so blinded by what you're trying to do at the moment, as the Secretary of State said, this is ring-fence money specifically for departments to stop and think, actually I can change that process in the following way, and I can deliver savings, or I can deliver better outcomes for people. I mean, just to give you a flavour of some of the stuff that's coming through, we've also obviously looked at the draft programme for government, and actually it's really encouraging the alignment around things like health, special educational needs, justice and so on. So you can actually see departments aligning with the draft PFG as well. So it's about helping the executive on that journey. But certainly the aspiration and the fiscal framework makes clear this is interim. The conversation there happens about, well, what would something else supported by experts that really helps the executive think this through look like for the longer run?
Can I just add something
Yes.
to that? So just in terms of how we're working with ministers, so working with Minister Nesbitt, going around to seeing some of the places which funding has been put in for and really understanding what's behind that bidding, so that it's not just about that fund, as we say. That's what I'm doing as well.
Brilliant.
Okay.
And then just one final question.
Yes.
You mentioned the 47 projects that have gone over to be evaluated and decided upon. What specifically is your role on the board, if that's okay?
So I'm one of three, and I suppose it's UK money as part of the fiscal framework. So partly I'll be providing assurance back to Secretary of State and the Chief Secretary of the Treasury that it's met the bar in terms of that. Is it transformational? Is it going to drive outcomes? So that's my role, along with Francis Ryan and Jane Brady. We do the sort of initial assessment, then it's Minister of Finance, then it's executive. I mean, just to say as well, the 47 went to 11. There are also 18 projects in the digital space where we have said actually that needs expertise. So there's also 18 projects that will be looked at in that, because that is really expert stuff. And what you didn't want was different departments trying to have little tiny digital solutions instead of actually what is the answer here in 2024 to all of that. So that will follow. But the first 11, I think very soon, Finance Minister will be getting those.
Thank you.
Thank you. David Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome. There remains some uncertainty regarding the government's plans on legacy. What's the timeline for the repeal and replace process, please?
Well, the short answer is as soon as possible, but it's quite a complex process. Now, we came to government with a commitment to repeal and replace. The Legacy Act was widely criticised in Northern Ireland. It achieved something unique, almost unique, which was to bring the parties in Northern Ireland together in opposition to what had been put forward. And I've heard that in meeting many victims' families since I was appointed. What does that mean? Getting rid of immunity, which was particularly objected to, restoring civil cases, inquests starting with the ones that were brought to a halt. But in respect of the independent commission, I looked at it and, yes, you could abolish it, but you abolish it. You waste 2.5 years, all the money that's gone into establishing the staff. You bring to an end the inquiries they're already undertaking. They've had about 100 inquiries. I think it's about 12 cases that they're looking at currently. And everybody I've met, I've put this question to them. Do you agree that there needs to be an information recovery function, a body? And they say yes. Do you agree that there should be the capacity to continue to investigate cases? Yes. Now that is the framework that Stormont House set out. The two functions are combined within the Commission, and the recent Northern Ireland Court of Appeal commented a favourable appeal on that. There are some who say they've got to be separate, some who say I'm not really sure that that is an issue. I am absolutely seeking to make further changes to the way in which ICRA works, because I'm very conscious, as is Sir Declan Morgan, that there is a problem of credibility because of its parentage. It came out of the Legacy Act, but the Legacy Act said the only thing that you can use henceforth is the Commission, because we're taking away your civil cases, we're taking away your inquests, and we're giving people immunity. Now, those last three are gone or in the process of going, and then you are left with the body, which I would encourage people to go and talk to. It is extremely difficult. There are some people who say we will never have anything to do with it. But, you know, Northern Ireland's history when it comes to legacy, and it casts a great shadow over Northern Ireland society because of the troubles and the legacy it has left for so many people, is all of those have had their difficulties. And in the end, if we search for the absolutely perfect, we could still be arguing about it in 10 or 20 years' time. And many of those families do not have the luxury of the time because they're all getting older. And the vast majority of those I've spoken to say, look, I recognise no one's going to be prosecuted. I just want to know what happened. Now, if you want me to come on to the Dillon judgment, I will do so. But
well, if I can just ask about the Commission itself then,
yes.
Given that is the part that you've committed to keeping,
yeah.
How would you like to see it being reformed? How will you engage stakeholders in that reformation process? And if I may as well, how will you orientate it significantly to more towards the reconciliation dimension of its remit?
Well, now that is a very interesting question, because I met a victim. His brother had been murdered, and he looked at me and he said, this legislation says I have to be reconciled to my brother's killers. And my reply to him was, no legislation can make anybody be reconciled to anyone. Reconciliation has to come from within. And I'm not sure that the title reconciliation in ICRA's title is fantastically helpful. Indeed, Mr. Justice Coltrane, when he delivered his judgment in February of this year, commented on that and said he didn't think that conditional immunity was going to do much for reconciliation. I agree with him. So for me, its function is to try and provide answers for the families who have waited so many years without knowing exactly what happened to their loved ones. And, of course, if there is evidence that might result in a prosecution, although the chances of that diminish over time because everybody's getting older, people have died, then, of course, there should be an ability to do that. Because some people said of ICRA, well, that's the end of all prosecutions. Sir Declan has been at pains to point out, I'm afraid that is not correct, because we have the capacity to investigate, and if we find sufficient evidence that might meet the threshold for prosecution, we pass it to the DPP, and the DPP makes its judgment in the normal way. So I am looking at ways in which we can strengthen confidence in ICRA, given that there is a lot of suspicion and reticence and opposition because of the way it came into being. But what I'm trying to do is to separate that out by dealing with immunity and civil cases and inquests, by saying if we all agree that you need those functions, We have a body with those functions currently. Can't we make it better rather than scrap it and start again to end up in, broadly speaking, the same place? Doesn't strike me, given the passage of time, as a very sensible approach to take. And to answer the second part of your question, I am currently in the middle of a very long series of meetings with all parties who have an interest in this, in which I ask that question: what would you like to see in the way of change to ICRA that might build your confidence to engage within it?
Off the back of that, sorry if I can interrupt, David. Off the back of that, I was just wondering, Secretary of State, but you know, what could ICRA learn from the Canova process?
That is also, I think, a really pertinent question, because Canova, there was scepticism about Canova when it came into being. I think the thing that Canova did was to take the families on the journey as they did their work. I can think of one person I've met who said, you know, I was part of the Canova process, and I can tell you it gave me what I've been looking for. I've met countless people who have said, at the time of my loved one's murder, the police came round and said, we'll be back in touch. No stone will be unturned to find out who killed your loved one. We never heard another word. Now imagine that, if your loved one had been murdered. Now, there are reasons why, you know, at the height of the Troubles, it was dangerous for police officers to investigate. Because if you were dealing with a murder now, you've got to secure the scene, you've got to secure forensic evidence and all of that. Things were much more difficult at the time. But it seemed to me that Canova won the confidence of the victims' families they were dealing with. And from talking to Sir Declan, the Commission absolutely understands that. They wish to take a trauma-informed approach. The proof will, of course, rest with what the families have to say after they have engaged, and I hope that it will be able to give them. ICRA has very considerable powers. This is the other issue. Very considerable powers to get access to all the information it requires. It has the power to question people. It has brought in this idea of what they call their enhanced inquisitorial procedure, which is in effect a public hearing. I welcome that unreservedly, because part of the reason people want to have an inquest or a public inquiry is they want the evidence, the facts, to be tested in the open. And very imaginatively, ICRA has said, well, we're not forbidden to do that by the legislation, so we want to do it for certain cases. That is then the subject of part of the Dillon judgment in the Northern Ireland Court of Appeal. So I think they understand that, but the test, the answer to your question, Chair, will be what the families make of it. But too many people have been let down too long by an investigation process that, as far as they're concerned, hasn't happened.
Thank you. Sorry, David.
Penultimate question from me, if I'm allowed.
Yes.
Just going back to ICRA then, Secretary of State, are you saying that you see no role for ICRA in the purpose or in the agenda of reconciliation, or do you see any other role for a UK government-supported reconciliation process in Northern Ireland?
Well, reconciliation is a process. It's about people's minds. It's how people come to terms with what has happened in the past. Look, I would say if families who've had no answers now get answers, it may or may not help them to be reconciled with what happened. And some will, and some will not. All of us deal with grief and loss in different ways. That's the truth. I think it's a very important part of the process, but I just had in my mind, when you asked me that question to start with, the gentleman who said, how can the law tell me to be reconciled, as I told you, and I gave him the answer that I did because it's what I believe. But it can undoubtedly contribute to that, and I want ICRA to succeed in that. Above all, I want it to succeed in the interests of the families who've waited for so long.
Okay, thank you. Last question from me. What parts of the September Northern Ireland Court of Appeal judgment are you seeking to appeal, and why?
It's a very, very complex judgment, indeed. And there were three essential elements to it. And I'm leaving on one side the question of Article 2 of the Windsor Framework. Because as you will know, when Mr. Justice Coltrane ruled back in February, he said that immunity was incompatible with the European Convention, but he also struck it down because he said it didn't uphold the requirements of Article 2 of the Windsor Framework, which gave him the power to strike it down, so it doesn't operate at the moment. So the Court of Appeal said three things. One is it said getting rid of civil cases is incompatible. Well, hey, that's the government's policy. So the Court of Appeal has backed what the new government has come in and said. Secondly, it has observed that where ICRA is acting as if it was an inquest, and they're looking in particular at the enhanced inquisitorial procedure I referred to earlier, there's a question of family representation, legal representation, and so on. And the third related to disclosure, as you will be aware. Now, it is complex. The honest answer to your question is the government is still considering this in consultation, as you would expect, with colleagues. But I have said repeatedly, and I take the opportunity of saying it again here today, I am determined to ensure that ECRA is a European Convention of Human Rights compliance body. I'm determined to do that. And there are two mechanisms for achieving that. One is a remedial order under Section 10 of the Human Rights Act. I've made two written statements to Parliament in July and September setting that out, and or legislation, primary legislation, and the reference to repeal and replace was of course contained in the King's speech. You can't just repeal the Act and put nothing in its place, and I hope in answering your question I've explained what approach I and the government are taking to try and move this forward. I'd like to do it as quickly as possible, but you're trying to develop the policy at the same time as the courts are coming along from time to time and expressing a view, which makes it a more complex process to manage, that's all.
Okay, thank you. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps just on legacy, very briefly, Secretary of State, I think it's fair to say, and members of the committee will acknowledge, that you're not responsible for the architecture that's before us, and in fact, your government in opposition supported many of the proposals for change and amendments at the time of the passage of the bill. But have the ICRIR raised with you their concerns that they will not achieve or receive information relevant to families from potential perpetrators because immunity has been removed?
Sir Declan has made it clear when it comes to information from the state, we are able to ask for and see everything. Now, there is a balance to be struck on immunity. To take a parallel example, the discovery of the locations of victims' remains. Now, Northern Ireland wrestled with, well, how are we going to bring forward information about where somebody's been buried? And the deal was, in that case, a form of partial immunity, which said, if you give us information which we will then use to try and discover the remains of those who were murdered, then nothing we find in the course of recovering the body, any forensic evidence we find in the grave, will be used to prosecute anyone. But entirely separately over here, if by other means we encounter evidence that might lead to you being prosecuted, well, that's an entirely different matter. That was the basis on which the body took its work forward. It's found a number of people, and it's so important to the families to be reunited with the remains of their loved one, but there's a small number who have not yet been found. So, but what the Legacy Act said is you just have to give the information and that's it. You can't be prosecuted at all. And in the end, I think, society has to make up its mind. I came to this role, I saw the almost universal opposition to the immunity contained within the Legacy Act and made the commitment we are going to get rid of it, which is what we're going to do.
So I agree with that. It doesn't answer the next question,
well,
of course, but
I suppose the question is, so is there a partial form of immunity? Is that something that...
I'm not going to parse partial or conditional, but I think it is one of the challenges on legacy, and I think you accept that too.
But of course, because to get people to come forward and private information which they haven't done in the past, well, of course we would like to do that, but there was such a serious objection to the immunity contained in the bill. That's why we've given the commitment to get rid of it, and I'm convinced that's the right thing to do.
As am I.
As are you.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Would you or would one of your colleagues like to explain the division of responsibilities on Windsor framework between the Northern Ireland Office and the Cabinet Office?
Yes. As you will know, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, Nick Thomas Simmons, is the co-chair of the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee. His opposite number is Maris Sefcovic. But I work extremely closely with him on a pretty regular basis. Indeed, the two of us have met you to talk about the Windsor framework. What we're both trying to do is to ensure that the Windsor framework is able to operate successfully. Its arrival, the Windsor framework, was a very, very significant step forward compared to the protocol that existed before. We have reminded Cabinet colleagues it's really important to take into account the implications for Northern Ireland, given the Windsor framework, the policy decisions that you are making. And we've done that on a number of occasions. The guidance has gone out under section, I think it was 46, that's the one, reminding all ministers and all parts of government about their obligations. So I suppose you've got two for the price of one who are working on it. Bargain. And I work closely. Well, you may call it a bargain. And who am I to disagree?
Yeah, pay half, pay twice. Secretary of State, thank you for that, and I think for the benefit of the committee it's important just to get the distinctions right. The Paymaster General has indicated, and you reaffirmed this morning in Westminster Hall, your desire to see negotiations commence on a veterinary agreement, an SPS agreement in 2025. Is that on track, and do you think those negotiations will commence at the start of the new year?
Well, it is for the European Union to... It has to decide a mandate for any such negotiations. But the difference between this government and the last is, the last government said, oh, the deal we got is perfect, doesn't need to be improved upon. And we've arrived and said, you know what, we can do better than this. And given the challenges in respect of the movement of, in particular, agricultural goods and food and plants across the Irish Sea from GB to Northern Ireland, a veterinary and SPS agreement would be a big step forward. It will require the government and the European Union to agree how that is going to be sequenced, but the desire is very clear. I think it's also fair to say that the EU has some things that no doubt they would want as part of the negotiation. So ultimately, we need to put forward, and we've already indicated the things that we're interested in, is for the EU to decide what a negotiating mandate would be. I think that is their process. They have to get a mandate for the negotiations so that they can commence. I can't give you a timeline as to when that will be, but clearly we'd like to get on with it as soon as possible because it could, as I said in my opening statement, bring real benefits.
Yeah. So there's no surety on that process, but what we do know is there's a cliff edge on veterinary medicines.
We do.
So the Veterinary Medicines Working Group was established, it's met on a number of occasions, but that cliff edge is fast approaching. Yep. So how will you, as His Majesty's Government, ensure the availability of veterinary medicines that are so important for farmers and our rural community and food security and safety in Northern Ireland?
Well, as it so happens, the Veterinary Medicines Working Group is meeting again on Thursday, I think, this week. And what is the process that we are engaged in? To understand what are, when all other steps have been taken, the medicines that otherwise will not be available. Because there's not been an argument. At the beginning, people said 50% won't be available. Now, I think through the work of the Veterinary Medicines Working Group, that percentage is coming down. And I think the strategy has to be to say, look, all of the efforts that can be made to ensure continued supply have been made, and it's to do with where batch testing takes place and pack sizes and all of those very, very practical points. If we end up at the point where there are certain medicines that are needed to treat certain veterinary diseases that it's quite clear will not otherwise be available, it seems to me that that is the moment you turn to the EU and say, are you actually arguing that those medicines will not, with those conditions will not be treated in Northern Ireland, given you've got a single epidemiological zone which is called the island of Ireland. Is that what you're advocating? And then we'd have to see how they would respond at that point. But that is what we're working to do. I don't know, Mark, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Those are the steps you envisage taking if no resolution is found.
Yeah, look, because it's a practical problem.
Yeah.
If we come to the conclusion and can persuade the EU there's no other way these medicines come available, we both have a problem, and farmers have a problem, and vets have a problem in Northern Ireland. So what are we going to do about it? Now, they did, in the end, they moved on human medicines when we're in the same position, and they changed their law, which showed that there is the capacity of the Commission to be pragmatic while we are implementing the Windsor framework in good faith, which we are committed to.
Okay. Thank you very much, Secretary of State. If we move on then, you've mentioned Windsor framework on a number of occasions.
I have.
But you haven't referred to in this session safeguarding the Union. And to use Ulster parlance, we talk about Windsor framework. You said about being significant progress, but it didn't get baby bathed, and the Assembly lay in abeyance after the publication of Windsor framework. But safeguarding the Union significantly moved issues forward. Are you committed to implementing safeguarding the Union?
I am. Indeed, I mentioned it at least twice and maybe three times in the debate that you and I were in earlier today. Well, I know it's a separate session, but I would draw your attention to the references I made to safeguarding the Union only a few hours ago. But of course, because it's an important part of the restoration package, and we're working very hard on a number of fronts. And although there are difficulties from time to time, as I also mentioned this morning, if you take, well, I mentioned human medicines, if you take dental amalgam, if you take the EU agreeing to delay for a year the new timber regulation, those are all examples of pragmatism where the representations and the discussions that we've had with the EU have enabled progress to be made. But it's constant work. But the reason for the framework is very simple. As I set out at some detail this morning, there was a problem when we left the European Union, and a practical way forward had to be found. And this is the way that has been found, and we've got to make it work. And if we don't operate it, we won't get the veterinary agreement that we all want.
And just to square the circle for committee on the supplementaries, people in Northern Ireland were given a promise on changes on parcels and on customs, and they were to have been implemented already. You have delayed the implementation of those until March 2025. Alongside that, there's been a drawback on the commitment on UK-wide labelling. So can I ask you, does March 2025 stand for customs and parcels? Can the people of Northern Ireland expect to receive their goods in the same way, in an unfettered way, throughout the United Kingdom internal market by March 2025?
Well, we are absolutely committed to that. There were practical difficulties with bringing the parcels arrangements into effect by the 1st of October. I mean, we had an election and various other things. The consequence of not, as you will know very well, of not proceeding with the parcels bit was the EU said, well, if that's the case, then the customs easements, which are important to you and to us, well, that's not going to happen in October either. So they've all moved forward to next year. But it's really important that we do that, both to honour the commitments that have been made in relation to parcels and to get the benefit of the customs easements that everybody moving goods across the RSC would very much like to see.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel Aldridge.
Secretary of State, I'd like to shift slightly. Windsor framework will remain with that, but it's in a previous world I worked a lot in IT and digital services and this worked specifically with those in Northern Ireland, so quarterly visit and work with those companies that were trading with the UK and the rest of the world. And the European Scrutiny Committee said in 2023 certain elements of the EU Artificial Intelligence Act may apply directly in Northern Ireland under the Windsor framework, but their impact on the UK's regulatory approach to AI is unclear. According to a European Parliament Research Service brief from April, EU-UK dialogues on such issues as AI, going beyond the trade and cooperation agreement, have yet to materialise. With the question that Gavin raised earlier about the different responsibilities with NIO and Cabinet Office around artificial intelligence. I just really, and I'm very aware this may not be something that you're able to answer right now.
You anticipate my answer, but yeah.
He was looking to me. And
No, not at all.
There's wide-ranging consequences to the impact of the EU AI Act, and I'd just like to seek some clarity on where we are with that.
Many things have crossed my desk since I took up this post, but the question that you've raised is not one of them.
Oh, well.
Okay? Now, the lead would be taken by my colleague Peter Kyle, because he's got responsibility for AI, and I think all I can undertake to do, if it is helpful, is to drop you a line with some response to the perfectly fair point that you've raised, but I'm not able to assist you today.
No, I
for the
really
reason
appreciate
I've set
that.
out.
Thank you. It's me again, isn't it?
It is you.
Okay, so moving on again slightly, but I will leave the AI point, which we'll all be pleased about. So what preparations are you undertaking to commission an independent review into the operation of the Windsor framework, if required by the outcome of the democratic consent vote?
Well, there is a clear process to be followed. I initiated the consent vote by writing to the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly. It then falls in the first instance to the First and Deputy First Minister, if they wish to table the vote. It remains to be seen whether they will or they won't. If they don't, then it falls to any other member of the Assembly to do so. The vote takes place. It is for the Assembly to make the decision. This is really important. If the consent vote is passed with cross-community consent, then there is no requirement to establish the independent review. If it is not with cross-community consent, but just a majority, then that review has to be established. I would say, because I don't want to anticipate the outcome, we will cross that bridge when we come to it, but we will, of course, fulfil all of the responsibilities that fall upon us to ensure that review, if it does prove to be necessary, can do its work.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thanks. And we've got a supplementary from Claire Hannah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Very interesting discussions. You may be aware that the Assembly yesterday endorsed an opposition motion about the scope of that review and endorsed the view that it shouldn't just take in the movement of goods east to west, because it is fair to say that over many years I think the focus was largely on those transactions and comfort to one political party in particular, and those were important issues, and I'm glad it was got right. But Brexit didn't just happen to sausages, you know, it did a lot of other things, and I think it's appropriate, and now the Assembly by a comfortable majority have endorsed this view that the review that is now mandated should cover other issues like some of the disruptions north-south, including on services and things like data, and perhaps on Daniel's AI question, like access to European funds, things like Erasmus, a number of other issues that have been affected, potential representation in the European Parliament, and there's precedent there for West Berlin and Gibraltar, but some of these issues should be explored, and I think we have minutely and acutely explored the feelings of a particular strand of identity and the movement of goods, and I think it is fair that some of the other impacts would be teased out. Are you open to following the endorsement of the Assembly of this view to ensure that some of those issues are caught in the scope of your inquiry?
Well, I have received a letter this morning from Matthew O'Toole drawing my attention to the motion that was passed, and of course, they're going to have to be terms of reference for the work of the independent review. I did raise an eyebrow when I saw the reference to representation for Northern Ireland in the European Parliament.
There is a democratic deficit.
I don't understand how that would work. But the focus of the review is on Articles 5 to 10 of the Windsor. That's what it's about, and therefore one would expect, in terms of reference, to ask the person who is appointed to focus on precisely that. Now, if they wish to include other things, I suppose that's a matter for them. But I think we ought to focus on the task in hand. That is not to say that there haven't been other implications of leaving the European Union, some of which you have drawn attention to. As I said in the debate this morning, personally, I wouldn't have started from here, but we're dealing with the consequence of a decision that the British people made, and we have to get on with it and manage it in the best way that we possibly can.
I'll just finish on that and say the reason that the terms are narrowed on those roles is because the world stopped turning, our lives stopped turning for many, many years to focus just on the niche concerns. And a lot of us had to park, including EU citizens and many, many others, had to park their concerns. And I think this is a way for this government to demonstrate that the views of all sections of society and the impacts on them of Brexit are now going to be of relevance, and that we're going to be able to find ways to move forward productively. One of the other issues we could explore is investing and properly selling the dual market access proposition. These are ways to truly make these new arrangements stick, and I do hope it is now, as I say, the express view of the Assembly that review will include some of these issues.
Well, look, I take the concerns of everybody who's been affected by Brexit extremely seriously indeed. I've met a number of businesses. Well, they're well aware of the opportunities that businesses located in Northern Ireland have got. They don't need a lot of selling to them because they're busy taking advantage of the dual market access. And I meet businesses in my constituency who say, well, I'd like very much to have what those businesses in Northern Ireland have got. And it is it's a great opportunity for the Northern Ireland economy. A wonderful place to invest. Lots of companies have done it. One of the joys of my job is meeting those who are producing wonderful things with great skill, exporting all over the world. And my encouragement to investors is come, look, see, believe, invest, because they can follow in the path that others have already done. And I think the other point I would make, which I mentioned to Gavin Robinson earlier, is this is a government that has said we want a closer relationship with the European Union. And that is a really big change compared to what we've seen in recent years, is it not?
Thank you, Secretary of State. Chris Fleur.
Hello, Secretary of State.
Hi.
I apologise for dominating your time on the way to the Chamber.
We had a lovely
to vote. I
conversation
feel like
about
we had
other
our
matters.
own private meeting, but I appreciate your indulgence there. I want to go back onto the topic of Casement Park.
Yes.
Having listened to many of your exchanges in the Chamber and also having read your declaration with the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport as well, I wondered if you had any indication from the Northern Ireland Executive on any revised proposals and whether you are still leaving the door open, if they have arrived or will arrive, for the UK government to also supply funding.
Look, the Northern Ireland Executive has had the objective of building Casement Park since 2011. It is a shared executive commitment. The prospect of the Euros, well, slightly complicated matters, because it was, of course, an extraordinary opportunity. And when the Euros were awarded to the United Kingdom and Ireland, everyone thought, right, well, that's Casement Park is done and dusted. Because the last government said, yep, it'll be built, yep, we'll find the money. We got elected in July, and of course, nothing had been done. Nothing for 18 months, apart from warm words. If I may say so, in passing, an example of making promises with no cash to back them up. So we very urgently undertook a review and said, is it possible? Because we're running out of time. And the review came back and said, we've looked at this, you could spend a very, very considerable amount of money, upwards of £400 million. A number of other things would have to be favourable, like changing the hours of work on the site, because there's been a long-running planning battle, as you know, from local residents, and there were limits on when the hours of building work could be undertaken. And even then, you can't be sure that you'd finish it in time. And if you put all that money in and still didn't spend it in time for the Euros, well, what would people say? What on earth did you think we were doing? So I'm afraid the only decision we could reach was this can't go ahead. And that then left, well, what are we going to do now? Now, what the Prime Minister has said is we need to see an alternative proposition, which is what your question alludes to. I have had a conversation with Jarlath Burns shortly after the decision was taken not to proceed with the stadium for the Euros, and I think it's reasonable to say, well, can we see it and how much is it going to cost? Because at the moment we don't know the answer to that question. Now, I'm not in a position to anticipate perhaps a follow-up question at this stage to say that the UK government would make a contribution. But in the end, you're going to have a proposition with a sum of money that is capable of building it, bearing in mind the continuing effects of building price inflation. But look, this is a really important project to the GAA community, because Windsor Park's been done, very good results recently. Ravenhill has been done, but Casement Park has not. And I think in the interest of respecting all of the sporting traditions of Northern Ireland, it's important that Casement Park is built also. And I would hope that the building of sports stadiums would be something that would unite society in Northern Ireland. I think I made that point in my first oral questions in this job. Sport normally brings people together. Can we do it on this too, please?
Just a quick follow-up.
Okay.
I think you make a very fair point about bringing communities together, particularly via sport. And it is an awful shame, of course, that the previous government hadn't allocated funds for us to have redeveloped this ground in enough time to be part of the Euros. Perhaps if we could stay in touch about any interventions from the Northern Ireland Executive and updates, that would be great, because it's a long time that we held a Football World Cup amongst our home nations and Ireland, and wouldn't it be fantastic if perhaps we've missed the Euros on this occasion, that it could be part of a World Cup bid?
Look, it's a great sadness to everyone. What an opportunity this was for football in Northern Ireland. And it was great that we were awarded the Euros. But if you're going to offer up, there were all the stadia that are built, apart from one which wasn't built. Yeah. If you're going to say, yep, we're going to go ahead with it, you might think in 18 months you'd actually have done something about it. But I'm sorry to report, basically nothing had been done and no money had been committed. But that's the past.
Thank you. Claire Hannah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And just on the previous issue, I note your commitment, which I know is genuine on casement. It is worth saying it isn't just an executive issue for two reasons. One, because it is a new decade, new approach that casement will be built, and because the last and the previous government did commit to I think, both in explicit terms of with or without the Euros and sadly without the Euros. It is worth saying that there is planning permission in place that took a very long time for a stadium below the Euros spec, which I understand would be considerably less than some of the figures that were being thrown about, particularly without that kind of emergency cost on it. So it is just important to point out that that does exist, and I know you have engaged with the GAA. You're also correct to say that the executive failed to move this for many, many years, and that is a tragedy as well. But I just would ask that it is considered not just an executive project, something that, because you and Dublin have both committed to, that you continue in interest, and I would hope you would perhaps re-engage with the GAA, who I know are keen to discuss the specifics now that unfortunately the Euros window has been missed.
I'd be very happy to meet them again, definitely.
Great,
having met Jarlath Burns,
brilliant.
but albeit by video.
I'll come back to you and go ahead and make that happen. Just want to briefly touch on assembly reform. You'll be aware that our predecessor committee produced quite a substantial report, bringing together kind of academic and political and other feedback on some potential reforms to the agreement, particularly Strand 1. And the argument from both the UK government and the Irish government at the time was, for understandable reasons, that we should wait till the Assembly comes back. It is now back, and 10 months on, this issue has not progressed. The Sinn Féin and the DUP declined an opposition proposal to have an ad hoc committee to explore it, and said it should go to AECR. That committee has met once, and reform wasn't discussed. And the First Ministers have repeatedly declined invitations to confirm that they don't intend to collapse the Assembly. So it does remain unstable. Would you agree with me that there are parties who have an explicit electoral interest in the status quo and who therefore won't be motivated to change it? Would you agree that actually having, designing out the vetoes assists those parties as well? Because while the veto is the button is there to be pushed elements of their coalition will often urge them to push it. Would you agree that it is unlikely, or it seems unlikely, that it is going to be reformed without some external influence, and do the government have a view on that?
Well, first of all, I read your predecessor's Select Committee report and all of the recommendations that you had made. Look, what is the truth here? The truth is that the power sharing arrangement contained in the Good Friday Agreement and amended subsequently enabled power sharing government to come to Northern Ireland. An extraordinary achievement. And the fact that Northern Ireland is a very different place now to what it was 26 years ago is a testament to that. The downside, as your question alludes to, is that it also contains the means of bringing the whole House down by one or other of the two parties holding those posts to walk out. Now, I want to say this about the executive. I would say the single most important thing that's happened in Northern Ireland this year was the restoration of the executive. When I became the Shadow Secretary of State, I said to Chris Heaton-Harris, anything I can do to support you in your efforts to get the institutions back up and running, I will do, because it's the single most important thing for Northern Ireland, because I think the people of Northern Ireland have been badly served by long periods of no government, and they need their government to be working on their behalf. But I'm very encouraged by the way in which the new executive has set about its work, the relationship between Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little-Pengelly, the fact there is now a fiscal sustainability plan, going back to the questions that you were asking me earlier, the fact there is a programme for government, and it seems to me there is a real commitment, the work that Mike Nesbitt is doing on health service reform. We should applaud and encourage and say we want to back you in moving that forward. So I don't like to dwell on the possibility that collapse may happen again. If it did, as I said at the British-Irish Association in September, well, we'd have to find a way forward in partnership with the Irish government, which, of course, is the co-guarantor with us of the Good Friday Agreement. And, of course, it makes sense to talk about this. The difficulty is, how do you achieve a consensus? That is the question. How do you achieve a consensus? Now, there are lots of things that you could point to, as the previous Select Committee report does. You look at the way the executive works with the rather siloed arrangements when it comes to ministerial departments. Now, that is a function of the way it was set up, but it doesn't support, if you like, collective ministerial responsibility in the way that we in Westminster would be only too used to. That is an issue. The fact that the Assembly wasn't functioning as well as the executive having collapsed. And I have talked about reform to a lot of people. There are a great deal of ideas around. But I think my answer to your question is you would need a consensus for change. And the consensus for change has to come from the parties in Northern Ireland. It seems to me it can't be imposed from outside. It has to evolve. But 26 years on, of course, any structure or institution, it makes sense to ask the question, could we be doing things better?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I bring in Saoirse Eastwood?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, it's lovely to see you in this setting, and Minister as well. It was brilliant to have you in Lagan Valley last week. Obviously, it would be completely remiss of the Alliance MP not to mention reform, considering that has been a key pillar of our policy and a party for a long time. I'm only a new MP. I was actually first elected to the Assembly in 2022, and we wasted years. And more importantly, my constituents in Lagan Valley had wasted years. And you said you don't want to dwell on the possibility of it collapsing again. But you know, I'm long enough in the tooth to remember the Chocolate Brothers. And we knew what way that went. And we've been there, and we've done this before, and we've bought the T-shirt. Alliance have been told that we've won the intellectual argument for reform. But what I just don't understand is, why are my constituents in Lagan Valley any less than somebody in Scotland or Wales or here in this mother of parliaments? Why do we have a system that allows my constituents to go without for years. Not just once, not just twice, not just 3 times, but consistently. So what do you say that I should say to my constituents when it happens again? Because there will be a when, because we haven't changed the system. So what should I say to my constituents the next time it fails?
It's a really, really fair question to ask. But I think it needs to be directed above all to those who have collapsed the institutions. Because, look, when we seek elected office, and if we're lucky enough to be elected, right, we take on a responsibility. And being in government, taking decisions, is tough. It's difficult. And you get a lot of criticism and aggravation, and for perfectly understandable reasons, because we live in a democracy, and long may it continue. One of the things I find I reflect on in Northern Ireland, when politicians walk off the job, because that's what it is. I know what would happen to me and Fleur if we walked off the job. Well, our constituents and society would have a lot to say, get back to work. But that doesn't seem to work in the same way in Northern Ireland, and that's because of the history of the place, how you got to power sharing in the first instance. And I think the argument I'm putting to you in response is it is for the parties to answer that perfectly reasonable question. Why, one then the other, over a long period of time, have you in the past denied your constituents, the benefit of having a government that is working on their behalf? Now, I hope very much that it is not going to happen again, and we may have an optimistic or a pessimistic view of what the future may hold. But anyone who thought that they would collapse it again, for what? Over what? Given the huge challenges that Northern Ireland faces, and also the extraordinary opportunities. You know, Northern Ireland, because of its dual market access, we've talked about the skill, the innovation, the creativity. I spoke about it at the conference at Queen's last week. The inventiveness, the sheer inventiveness of people in Northern Ireland over a long period of time. And if you want to serve the public and you get elected, you've got a responsibility. I don't mean to lecture too much, but I do think it's part of the job. And the second part of the answer to your question, and I'm well aware because I've discussed with Naomi Long the question of reform on a number of occasions, is in the end it is incumbent on the parties to agree what reform may look like if they're able to do so, because it was the parties coming together that enabled the Good Friday Agreement to happen. It was the political courage, the consensus, the willingness to move that has changed Northern Ireland over 26 years. And the same process will have to happen for reform to advance. But if I may say so, you're absolutely right to ask the question, because lots of other people are asking it too.
I appreciate that. And just to close this out on one last point, we had a conversation about financial stability at the start of this, and collapse costs. It costs in monetary terms, it costs in economic, opportunities lost, it costs in terms of people's lives. You said there, more or less, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but stop me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure you will, more or less asking turkeys to vote for Christmas around the table in the north, which clearly is not going to happen. So in lieu of that happening, we have a situation where you said at the start the Good Friday Agreement is the bedrock and the cornerstone. And I completely agree with you. But what I would say, just in closing back in a wee thing to maybe reflect on, is that if that is the case, well then surely we owe it as the UK government and the Irish government and everybody elected to any position in Northern Ireland to make sure that we don't have a situation where the architecture enables that to arise again, you know. Moving on then to question number 10. Sorry, you gonna...
just because we just missed one out, so if that's okay, and then we'll come back to you. Is that okay?
Perfect,
Thank you. Just to tidy it up.
Just to close it off, I think it's important that people know review is in the Good Friday Agreement, so we're not stepping outside of those parameters. Review is in the Good Friday Agreement. None of the proposals in our predecessor report in any way propose to deviate from the principles of power sharing and partnership and compromise. And I suppose it's fair to say I don't think the government has a role to just be hands off and let the government sort it out. This government and the Irish government are co-guarantors, and we know that the Good Friday Agreement didn't happen organically, unfortunately. There were ideas out there, but there was a convening. And you say that there's no consensus. The way you get consensus is to talk about it, and the parties have indicated that they are open to reform. You're not pushing at a very, very closed door. Unfortunately, I am hearing that there isn't an interest or an intent to galvanise this conversation, but I will just say that it is already, the review is designed in, and 26 years on, I think people would have absolutely expected that would be triggered. On a separate matter, how does the new UK-Ireland summit differ from the existing British-Irish Council and British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which were designed in and endorsed in the agreement?
Well, it's an addition to it, and I think a very welcome one, because let's be frank, relations between the last UK government and the Irish government were pretty bad, to put it mildly. And we've been through a torrid time, not least when the last government signed agreements and apparently had absolutely no intention of honouring them. That's really bad for our reputation in the European Union, hence my point about the Windsor framework and getting to a veterinary and SPS agreement that we want, and was really bad for our relationship with the co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, as we've just been discussing. So, I mean, I must confess there's a multiplicity of bodies. I've got a list somewhere of all of them, and there are quite a few. But it's good to talk. Actually, it's good to talk. And I was delighted that Michael Martin accepted my invitation to come to Hillsborough to meet me very early on in my time. I think it was the 11th of July, if I recall correctly. And I have met him on a couple of occasions since. There's a lot to talk about. So I welcome the fact that the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach are going to be meeting on a very regular basis. That is a good thing.
Thank you very much. Well, I warmly endorse talking, engagement. We had many years of plenty of it. It does just endorse my view that there's nothing that this body does that couldn't have been done within the Good Friday Agreement toolkit and the existing body. So it is difficult for people to understand why we created a new one. But the last thing I would say, the reset is so welcome, but I would just urge the government, don't just reset strand 3. There are 2 other strands in the agreement. They are interlinked, interchangeable, and one cannot prosper without the other. So don't just focus on east-west. You do need to look also at the internal strand 1 arrangements and a north-south as well, as per some of the things I outlined in the proposal about the EU.
Well, I hope what we've said today suggests that we're focusing on all of them.
Thank you, Secretary of State. I'm going back to Saoirse. Maybe you might have a little bit of a break now.
Well, sure. I'm worried about Mark, who hasn't been on today. But he's probably sitting there thinking, well, that's fine by me.
So, Minister, you mentioned the issue of violence against women and girls in your opening remarks. And that's something that is personal to me in terms of my lived experience, but my constituents in Lagan Valley. And actually, 24 women have been killed in the last number of years, and that includes one of my constituents. So it's something that so many women are living under, the fear of violence, the reality of violence in their home, in the streets. And we are being so judicious in this committee so as not to tread into devolved spaces. But I really do feel that the societal issues that are prevailing at the minute against women and girls are of such quantum that whenever I had my Prime Minister's question the other week, I was wanting to start a UK-wide conversation, because the issues impacting some of the women and girls in Northern Ireland will be the same in Scotland, Wales or anywhere else in the UK. It's a difficult one because it does have some responsibility with the Executive Office who are leading on the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, and also Naomi is the Justice Minister. But do you see a role for the UK government to support not just the executive, which you're doing, but to have a UK-wide conversation, particularly about that online space, which is not devolved? How do you see that relationship working in terms of improving that?
Absolutely. I'm really glad you've raised it. I know the Chair has raised this issue in the past as well, and other members of the committee as well. And I really welcome that, because we need to talk about this issue. And if we're not all talking about it everywhere that we can, in this committee, wherever I go, every single space, then we are not going to tackle this, because, as you say, the problem is just too great. So you're quite right. We're not saying this is devolved and that's the end of it. Instead, this new Labour government has put tackling violence against women and girls at the centre of its programme. We have a new Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women, which highlights the importance that the government places on this. We want to halve violence against women and girls. We've got a very clear ambition to do that and use every lever to do that. So that means that we are having a UK-wide discussion, and Northern Ireland must be part of this. This is police reform, it's specialist rape services in courts, piloting domestic abuse protection orders, strengthening the justice system, empowering victims with specialist support, work in schools. All of these different ways we need to be having this conversation and taking really concerted action with measurable targets that we achieve and setting ourselves that aim. So we are having this conversation across the UK, and in Northern Ireland it's great that the strategic framework is in place and that conversation is being held as well, because we need to learn from each other. If a police force in England is putting in a specialist rape court or specialist rape unit, we need to learn from that across the whole of the UK and make sure, for example, and make sure there's very practical ways we actually are pushing forward as fast as we can, because we have waited too long for this action and it needs to be done. And you mentioned safety online as well. So the previous government brought in the Online Safety Act, which we will be absolutely making sure that it's enforced to the fullest extent. So that in place things like harassment, sexual exploitation, intimate image abuse, extreme pornography, controlling or coercive behaviour, and those age limits as well on social media. But we're going to go further. So that conversation is being held right now. There will be further work on the online space to make sure that wherever women and girls are, if it's in their place of worship, on the streets, school, university, home, wherever it is, that women and girls are safe. So the online space is important, but so are all of those other spaces as well. So it's something that I am committed to doing. I raise it all the time wherever I go. I'm also on the, I'm on the Child Poverty Taskforce, and I think that work very much aligns as well. We can't tackle one without the other. So that will be another area in which it's raised. And that's a very high level task force. It's chaired by the Secretary of State for Education and the Secretary of State for Department for Work and Pensions. It's got the Deputy Prime Minister on it, many ministers, and there was a meeting of the devolved regions and nations on child poverty as part of that task force as well. So very much UK-wide, inbuilt from the start. And that's very important. And the Secretary of State for Education is coming to Northern Ireland very soon to work with local community organisations and talk about child poverty. And the Secretary of State for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women, Jess Phillips, is coming to Northern Ireland as well and be holding a roundtable to talk about what this means, this UK-wide conversation that you're talking about, what it means in the Northern Ireland context. So we want to go at pace, and I'm really glad that you've raised it here.
Thank you for that response. And I suppose just before I hand over to others, there is a real risk, particularly in the online space for children, and that really concerns me. I obviously do, as we all do, a lot of work with school groups, community groups, like the Girl Guiding, whatever, and the amount of comments that I have received, either anecdotally or through casework, from worried parents or educators or carers or whoever, is so concerning. And there have been recent cases highlighted in the media about the particular element of online sexual exploitation of young people, and that really, really concerns me, because it's difficult sometimes to disaggregate all these issues, but actually ultimately the end point is still the same, and it's harm, and it's how we actually get those bits in place. So I think I'd be really interested in all of that work, but also particularly the online space as well, in terms of radicalisation of young people, but also the severe harm that they're coming to and how we limit that as well.
I would agree with you. I mean, as a parent, it's that one of those areas in which I cannot know what they're seeing online. The government has to step in. There has to be regulation to do this. You can't expect parents to do that. You can't expect teachers to do that. It has to be the government's position to do that. I'm also very concerned about age. Some of the most horrifying evidence I've had from police forces has been about the young age in which children are exposed to extreme pornography online. That's absolutely dreadful. Yeah. And that we cannot tackle society-wide misogyny if that's happening. So that it also concerns me as well. And this conversation that we're having, it's a very live conversation about the online safety bill, but it doesn't stop there as well.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Dr. Al Pinkerton.
Thank you, Chair. As a not quite yet rehabilitated academic from my previous life, you will perhaps be unsurprised that I'm going to ask you a question about education. Now, in the budget recently, there was an announced £730,000 for schools to achieve integrated status. And I just wondered if you could update the committee about how you see that being distributed.
So the government supports integrated education through two particular funding streams. One of them is to the Integrated Education Fund, the IEF, and the other one is to the Northern Ireland Council for Integrated Education. Together, we've delivered £1.9 million of grant funding over 3 financial years. So the Integrated Education Fund does the advocacy, so giving parents the information and promoting the cause of integrated education, especially because there's quite a lot of fear about what if my school was to go that way, would I lose out? And instead, actually, it would be of benefit, and you maintain your identity, but have that in an integrated way. And then the council is much more about the supporting schools when they're going through that process and giving them the technical expertise and the change of governance that needs sometimes a bit more finance as well to do that. So those two are very complementary to each other. And I've also been meeting with the Northern Ireland alumni who are either, some of them are parents, but some of them have been through integrated education as well, and they're doing the campaigning work too. So those are both the sides of it which we're supporting, and I'm very glad that within the budget just now, it was announced that there'll be £730,000 of funding for 24 to 25. So that completes the funding cycle for those, and we'll be asking for that to continue as well. So that's the way in which we support integrated education. There is a really long way to go. I'll highlight. Only 8% of pupils in Northern Ireland go to an integrated school. Only 5% of schools are integrated. That is such a small amount. It was in the Good Friday Agreement that integrated education would be promoted. We're 26 years on for such a small amount of progress. It's definitely something that we want to be working on. And when the Secretary of State for Education visits that I've just mentioned, she'll be coming to an integrated school. I've been to Erne College, and I've spoken with the pupils as well about what a benefit it brings to their lives, to their community. And so for some of them, they just take it for granted now that they're in integrated education. But for those others who have been through not integrated education in other ways, then they can see the benefit of those schools that have.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Chair. I don't mind who takes this now. So. Up to you, the defence industry. You'll know that this committee held an inquiry just prior to the general election, and you'll also know that there was a commitment in Safeguarding the Union document about promoting and extolling the benefits of increasing defence spend within Northern Ireland. Secretary of State, Minister of State, do you agree that there is work to be done on that commitment within the command paper?
Well, there is a defence review taking place. There are obviously 2 particular issues that are very close to your heart in relation to Spirit and Holland and Wolf, because it's really important that we achieve an outcome in which both of those are continuing to contribute, to aircraft manufacture and to the building of ships. I don't know if it's helpful just to comment on those, or...
Well, I was going to ask you...
Are you going to ask about that anyway?
So please do, but
yes, if
obviously a constituency interest...
yes, no, of course. Look, as you'll be well aware, Boeing are buying back Spirit because they've had some problems with Spirit's quality control. I think it would be a fair way of describing it. In the United States, it's not a reflection on any work that's been done at Spirit in Belfast. But they have indicated they don't have a particular interest in the function in Belfast. Airbus are very interested in the making of the A220 wings. I've been around that production facility. It is extraordinary, high-tech manufacture. Indeed, Airbus want Spirit in Belfast to produce more A220 wings, which is a great opportunity. But it's a difficult time of uncertainty, in particular for the workforce. I spoke to the unions, I think it was, earlier this week, or no, it was last week. I spoke to the unions about this. And the position is Airbus wants to purchase the wing manufacturing parts. Boeing say they want to sell the rest. The plant makes parts for Bombardier and others, including Rolls-Royce. I have spoken to Spirit, I have spoken to Airbus, to Bombardier, and the unions. We all want the plant and all of the workers and all of the skill to have a secure future. It is a commercial matter currently. We'll have to wait the outcome of the negotiations. On Harland and Wolff, the parent company is in administration, but not the actual yard itself. They did apply for a loan. The government said, my colleague, the business secretary, said it would not have been value for money. There clearly have been significant problems with the way in which Harland and Wolff has been run, and there have been changes in the management. We are hoping to see a commercial resolution which safeguards shipbuilding in Belfast and the other three sites. Navantia, as you'll be aware, which has, together with Harland and Wolff, the 3 Fleet Solid Support Ship contract, is currently in negotiation with the owners of Harland and Wolff. Riverstone, I can't say more for reasons, as you will understand, of commercial confidentiality, but again, as is the case with Spirit, everybody would like to have certainty about the future as quickly as possible. I hope that assists the committee.
Thank you, Secretary of State. If I just confirm, obviously the National Shipbuilding Strategy in 2017 was very important. The ability to attract government work to Northern Ireland was incredibly important. The allocation of the award for the Fleet Solid Support Ships remains crucial for the regeneration and renaissance of shipbuilding in Belfast. But I suppose my first question, and I appreciate the constituency responses, my first question was about the commitment within safeguarding the union, or government's commitment more generally. Do you, as Secretary of State, acknowledge that when Northern Ireland is receiving £60 per head of government spend on defence, as opposed to the £300 per head UK average, or the £2,500 in the southwest and southeast of England, that actually there's a good opportunity for Northern Ireland in benefiting from additional investment from UK government in a way that others haven't really thought about before?
Yeah, I agree with you that there is an opportunity. Now, to take advantage of that opportunity, you have to have the capacity, obviously, to make the things that those who are engaging in defence procurement want to buy. And you also need to have stability to encourage investment in Northern Ireland. And one observation I would make, going back to Miss Eastwood's question about the stability of the executive, and also Miss Hannah's, is that having the executive operating is absolutely fundamental to encouraging more investment in Northern Ireland. Because there are businesses that will say, well, great place, great skills, also making sure that we're training up the skills that are needed for the industries of the present and the future. But I heard one person say to me, but isn't that a place where they don't have a government from time to time? And if Northern Ireland really wants to help itself, then stability of the institutions is absolutely vital in the area of defence as well as others.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Secretary of State, yesterday Parliament passed second reading legislation on Armed Forces Commissioner, and you will know directly that you are involved in a process of reappointing a Veterans Commissioner for Northern Ireland. Can you share with the committee where that process lies, how many applicants you have received, and what the time scale will be for appointment?
Well, the recruitment process was launched on the 16th of October. Applications closed on the 1st of November. The interviews were held, which are not undertaken by me, but by others, on the 14th of November. I am currently awaiting a report and recommendations from the interview panel, because following Danny Kinahan's resignation, and I met him and I thanked him for the work that he had done as the Veterans Commissioner, I was determined that we got on and appointed somebody new in the post, because it's a very important job, above all, to veterans in Northern Ireland.
Do you think it'll be done by the end of this calendar year?
Well, now this is, I think, I would very much hope so. It depends.
At the end of this month, Secretary of State?
Well, now that depends on when the report appears on my desk and the speed with which I take a decision. I'm not bad in the latter, and I'm sure the wonderful NAO civil servants with whom Fleur and I have the absolute privilege of working. I tell you, it's one of the things that we have found since we've taken up the post. Fabulous civil servants who do a terrific job. I'm sure that report will arrive with me
imminently.
They have a commitment from the Permanent Secretary. What more could you want?
If you outline your expectation to this committee, I have no doubt it will be adhered to.
Quite. You're most kind. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. And last question then, Katrina Murray.
Thank you very much, Chair. Right, Secretary of State, we talked earlier about the mission-led government, way back, about the mission-led government. And of course, one of those missions was to make the UK a clean energy superpower.
Yep.
And one of the things that the committee is interested in is that the government has said it does not anticipate that GB Energy funding specific projects in Northern Ireland. Are you concerned that Northern Ireland will not realise the same benefits from GB Energy as elsewhere in the UK?
Well, I mean, Fleur, I know, has looked at this. Can I just make a broader observation? This is a great opportunity for all parts of the United Kingdom and for businesses. Now, let's take an example. 70% of heating, roughly, home heating in Northern Ireland is oil-based, and a net zero transition means moving away from that to one based on electricity. These islands are absolutely blessed with what I described last week as, the liquid gold of this generation, which is wind-powered electricity. We are in a fantastic position. I welcome, for example, the approval by Ofgem recently of the new interconnector that will come from Scotland to Northern Ireland. And when I looked at the city and growth deals, a lot of the focus in all of those, which the government is helping to support with its funding, is focusing on green energy of the future, hydrogen and electricity generation itself. I think Great British Energy is a great opportunity, and I know, Fleur, you have something to say about that because you looked at it in particular.
Well, it's being worked out. So the Great British Energy, despite the name, is actually to benefit all four nations. So the money being spent on setting it up is to be set up for an energy company for the whole of the four nations, and that is being worked out exactly what that means, because, as the Secretary of State said, it's a different market. It's an all-island grid. The primary source is oil. There's a different regulator. It's a different market. So that the details of that is being worked out, but it is absolutely intended to be beneficial for customers in Northern Ireland. And it's very, very important to reach the net zero target. It's very, very important to bring down bills as well for families in this cost of living crisis. So the Northern Ireland Executive is investing in this. They're investing 15 million in energy and resource efficiency support scheme. They're investing £75 million via the Invest to Save fund. So there's money going into this from the Northern Ireland Executive. And it's important that now the GB Energy, as it's set up, and it's being done in tandem with working very closely with the Executive and the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, to make sure that it does deliver for everyone in Northern Ireland as well.
Can I just add one thing? That it's quite clear that the future is going to require a lot more electricity generation. A world of electric vehicles and heat pumps, well, that's obvious. But it's also vital to attracting the new industries. Now, as it so happens, last Friday in my constituency, I went to visit a data centre. And one of the things they said to me was, the places where data centres, because as the cloud expands, we're storing more stuff, AI comes in, this is a huge business opportunity. One of the determinants of where those data storage companies go is there enough electricity supply? Now there's an opportunity, seize that, then that's one area in which if Northern Ireland sought to do so, it could attract the new industries of the future, and then there's all the knock-on benefits. So the future beckons, but we've got to grasp it with both hands.
Can I? Oh, yes, go on.
Sorry, you're baiting me into this, and I have thought this through, right? So the King's speech, I heard GB Energy, and do you know what I thought in my head? We have a perfectly viable regional site, just so happens to be in Lagan Valley, but it's actually the Maze Longcash site. And I did press off the back of that King's speech, and I said, look, I think we have an opportunity here, because you mentioned yourself the skill, the ingenuity. We're the land of inventors, Harry Ferguson, Frank Pantridge, all these people. And you know what? What really gets to me is that we need to bring people with us on this journey of net zero, the language. Sometimes I don't use that language because sometimes it puts up barriers to people, right? But we have a really big opportunity, not just in the UK, but particularly in Northern Ireland, to harness that to a next generation of young people and say, come and be on the tools, come and do one day in the college or whatever, and get a really competitive wage as an apprentice, as somebody who is learning. And for me, I would be very up for having those conversations in terms of how we link, because we know that skills is the next place of battleground in terms of the war on talent, everything else we've seen in a really tight labour market. I used to work in skills and HR, it's something I'm very passionate about, particularly apprenticeships. But if there's anything I can do from my end of things in terms of having that conversation to really, leverage what we have, because you're absolutely right, Secretary of State, we have a really unique geographical position on these islands where we can harness that and not just do it in terms of environmental improvements, but actually social improvements as well, where we're bringing the next generation of people online to those really important jobs.
I agree with every single word you've just said.
Great, let's do it.
It's a fantastic opportunity, but it has to be seized, and that is a job for all of us.
Yeah. And I'm going to be a donor. And I was just wondering, because the oil, there's so much oil that's being used currently in heating systems, I wondered whether there is scope or need for a transition fuel, rather than, because we have to get from A to Z by going through every other letter in the alphabet, and I just wondered if that's something that's in your portfolio or something that you've been looking at.
Well, no, not specifically, but I mean, if you take hydrogen, which will power parts of our industrial future, there is that debate about blue hydrogen as opposed to green hydrogen. Some people say blue hydrogen is the transition to green hydrogen. There's the debate about carbon capture and storage. Look, there's a lot of discussions taking place about how we make the transition, but the need to make it is beyond doubt. Just look at what is happening around the world, and it's seeing it as an opportunity rather than, oh gosh, we've got to make this change. It is an opportunity. The people who get on board first, people who have to make the heat pumps, and people have to make the batteries and the electric vehicles and the electrolyzers that will produce the green hydrogen. At the moment we're turning off wind turbines when we can't cope with the electricity on the grid. Well, what a fabulous opportunity to say, well, just keep turning and make some hydrogen which you can store or stick it in a battery. I mean, these are all the debates that are taking place about how we're going to create and use the energy in future in a way that's zero carbon and to help economic development.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Secretary of State.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister, and thank you to the officials. I'd like to say order, order.